Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, so that was a great introduction. And today we are talking about soil, microorganisms, and the whole root zone around plants. So I don't want anyone to get too freaked out. We are going to start with some like basic botany stuff and go over some terms that are just important for what we're going to talk about and understanding some of this stuff. So it isn't all going to be super scientific. But we will start there a little bit and then kind of move through the more recent research that has been coming out with microorganisms and how they interact with plants and each other. And it's very cool and sounds very science fiction-y, but there's research to back it up. So we'll go ahead and get started. There we go. Once I need to clear up the screen a little bit so I can see what I'm talking about here. Okay, so background information. Some basic plant parts. Obviously, we have roots, stems, leaves, eventually a flower, which gets pollinated, and then we have seeds that are produced, and that's the whole plant cycle. So the purpose, the life cycle of the plant, it wants to take in nutrients that it needs in order to produce a really strong, viable seed or multiple strong, viable seeds to continue and grow more plants again in the future. And so the basic concept has always been that the plant takes in nutrients that is bonded to water, and it also takes in oxygen through its roots. So we have our root cap, also known as the meristem, or the cap is like an external layer that is over the meristem. And then there's a region of elongation. So this is where we have, and we're gonna go to our third graphic there on the bottom, our parenchyma cells or tissues. Those are the cells that multiply really quickly. They perform most of the functions of the plant. So they're not just found in the root, they're throughout the plant. And they are very multifunctional. They do a lot of different things. Some of them photosynthesize, some of them produce proteins, they just kind of do everything. So our other two cell types we won't really talk about today, so those are on there, but those are both very structural. So one is a growing structure. As the plant grows, it provides a little bit of stability. And then our third type that we won't talk about much today is sort of those structural cells that have now died. And so that's more like the bark of a tree. So we won't really talk about those much, but the parenchyma tissues, as they grow and they're dividing, sometimes their cell walls are kind of thin. So that comes into play a little bit with what we'll talk about today. And those are found in that region of elongation of the root. So that's something we'll talk, that's a region that we'll talk about a lot. So just keep in mind that those cells are growing and dividing. So the cell walls sometimes are thinner. And that part of the root is just expanding greatly. So we do know that, or previously we've always talked about how, organic matter breaks down in the soil. So our nematodes and bacteria are important for breaking down all of these dead plant materials or dead animals, whatever it may be, and that releases the nutrients into the soil, and then the plant can take up water and nutrients. It spreads around the plant, and because hydrogen and oxygen in the form of water is escaping through the top of the plant, it creates a vacuum that sucks up all of the water and nutrients from the soil. The plant takes in CO2 through the top and then releases that down into the soil. And so that was always our symbiotic relationship, because the bacteria and some other microorganisms living in the soil want that carbon dioxide that is coming from the plant. So it creates a vacuum and a cycle that is symbiotic. So that's really where most basic botany and plant biology has been. And then a little bit more on this within our rhizosphere. So that's a word that's thrown around a lot, but that basically just means root zone. So we have rhizomes. So that's just our microorganisms that like to live in the root area of plants. So we've always known that in a field, for example, like a cornfield or something, there's more microorganism activity right around those root zones. So anywhere that there aren't roots of plants, there's not as much activity. And some of these things are good and some are bad. So we have some nematodes that are beneficial to the plants and some that will attack it. There's lots of fungi, bacteria, and so you can see on this little soil food web some of what we just talked about, where some, animals, plants, they die, that becomes organic matter, and we need all of the bacteria and fungi to break that up to make those nutrients available. Well, that's not the whole story, and we'll talk more about that on the next slide. But there are instances where some plants work together. We know from planting, intercropping, we plant marigolds next to our tomatoes, and that is beneficial for attracting insects above the soil, but also potentially below the soil. And why do those things work better when they're planted together? We have other plants like mustard that we know produce chemicals that don't allow other weeds or other plants to grow around it. So is it just the plant producing this chemical, or are there more things going on in the soil that we maybe haven't talked about previously? So that's our plants working together or not. Sometimes there's beneficial relationships, and sometimes plants don't want anything else to grow around them. And then part of what we talked about with our plant cycle, and that the plants take up these nutrients and ultimately want to produce seeds. Well, if they don't have the correct nutrients to take up, they won't have the correct nutrients in the seeds, and therefore the seeds that are planted next maybe aren't as strong. If they don't have the right nutrients, just like in our human bodies, they can't fight off diseases and nematodes and fungi that are attacking their roots as well. So we need to have healthy seeds. To have healthy seeds, we need to have a healthy plant to produce those seeds. Anything else on this? Sometimes I have to check my brain a little bit, make sure I mentioned everything that I wanted to talk about here. Yeah, I think so. So now we'll move into some more of the more recent research that's looking more at this, and not just nutrients available to the plant, as in putting on a fertilizer to make sure that the nutrients are there for the plant, but we also need to make sure that there are correct nutrients there for the microorganisms. So if there's, if the plant is being attacked by a nematode that's trying to eat its roots, it can put out a chemical or something to attract another nematode to attack it so that its root stops being attacked. The plants can also do this if they're being eaten by an aphid. They will switch the chemicals that they're producing to produce a chemical to make the aphid go away, instead of putting that energy into producing a seed or a fruit or continuing to grow. It kind of transfers its energy to fight the thing that is attacking it. Same thing if it's being attacked by, a bacteria or a fungus on its leaves, but this also happens in the root zone, and it can potentially send out signals that will attract other microorganisms to come rescue it, sort of. So if it's being eaten or there's a fungus attacking it, it can send out signals to bring in the parasitic microorganism that'll come attack that other thing and leave the plant alone. So this goes into the Rhizophage cycle. So this is sort of a newer term that's being thrown around, and this is from a paper from 2018, I think. Yeah, there we go. I couldn't see my own writing down there. So we're really looking more at this the root zone and the whole area around it, all of the microorganisms that live there, how they interact. So we know that the plant can send out signals to get other fungi, bacteria to come to its rescue by attacking things that are attacking it, and that the plant takes up nutrients from the soil. But what this is really looking at is that the bacteria and some fungi, they're living in the soil and they're taking up the nutrients. And so it seems now what they're finding is that the plant actually takes up the microorganisms. The plant isn't just taking up nutrients from the soil, it's also taking in the bacteria and some fungi and other microorganisms, and it is breaking those down in this very end of its root. So in this elongation zone that we talked about at the beginning, the very tip of the root where it's growing, the microbes will, I need to move stuff around on my screen again. The microorganisms are taken up through the meristem. Because there's more oxygen in the roots than there is in the soil, they enter this area of really high oxygen, and that actually changes, depending on if it's bacteria or fungi, it changes the cell in a certain way and sort of makes the cell regress a little bit. And in doing so, the plant, the parenchyma cells in this expanding zone, in the root zone, can suck the nutrients out of the bacteria or the fungi. So it kind of moves through so slowly. The cells extract the nutrients that it wants. And when it has pulled all of the nutrients out, the now spent bacteria or fungi are pushed out of these root hairs in that elongating area of the root stem. And so that's how we get a lot of the root hairs that form on roots, which was really thought originally that those were more expanding out to go find more nutrients. And now it seems that they're actually formed as an exit for these bacteria and fungi that have sort of had all of the nutrients sucked out of them. And so then those bacteria, they're still alive and they're still fine. They're just now nutrient depleted. So now they will go out through the root zone, break down some more stuff, fill back up on nutrients, and then go back into the root again. And so it creates this cycle. So this can also be done, the plant in this meristem area, so right around the root tip, it will actually put out proteins and lipids and sugars that will attract the microorganisms that it's looking for. So the plant knows which microorganisms, which bacteria or which fungi that it needs to attract, because some bacteria might be high in zinc and some might be high in calcium. And so the plant knows what it needs, and it puts out a chemical that will attract the bacteria or fungi that it needs, and then take that in, extract the nutrient that it needs from that specific thing, and then send it back out on its way. So the plants can also, it seems, do this to deter the plants around it. So it's not just mustard producing one chemical that makes the plants around it not grow anymore. It can actually attract bacteria or fungi that will not harm that one plant itself, but will harm all of the other plants around it. So it can create this, this culture in its own root zone and in the surrounding area that won't let any other plants grow. So this is possible because each plant seems to have its own signature. Different plants, even in the same family, oftentimes want or need different bacteria. If the bacteria or fungi is taken up by a different plant, sometimes that plant can't extract the nutrients from it or whatever it wanted from that microorganism, and that organism then is just sort of taking up space. So the plant is still taking in microorganisms, but it's unable to get what it needs from them. So in that sense, that's how the plant's attracting certain microorganisms can actually hinder plants near it from growing as well, because their space for microorganisms is taken up, but they aren't getting what they need from it. As Carrie, okay. And then this can also be true of diseases, other insects, if the plants can exude other, they'll change. It's not just it's being attacked by an aphid and internally the plant is now changing what it's producing. It produces chemicals. It sends extra cells to heal that hole that the aphid caused. It can also exude different chemicals and proteins into the soil to attract other microorganisms to help get those nutrients that it needs to produce those chemicals. So there's really, at any one time, so many different like chemical signals being sent around the plant, and so much that we still don't fully understand. So a lot of this, this paper is from 2018. Some of this research was done starting back in the 90s, but there hasn't been a lot of support or funding for a lot of this. So there have been some studies that have been happening kind of slowly. This also takes several years to study. You find one thing in one growing season, which is usually 1 year, unless you can grow things quickly in a lab and get multiple. So this is some ongoing research that will take more time and is still just sort of at the cusp of what people are starting to understand. There's also so many plants and bacteria out there in the world that it will, we will probably never fully understand everything that is occurring. And I think I'll go ahead and move on. So there's another study that I want to touch on that is related to this. So our own Richard Mulvaney here at the University of Illinois is one of the authors on this paper. And he talks a lot about nitrogen in corn. So back in the 90s, he admits this in a podcast. So I listened to the podcast. I've read a couple of the papers that he's published. So he says that, when he was doing his dissertation and when he was first starting out, he really encouraged people to use nitrogen on corn, to do this fall application of nitrogen. And now he has his name on papers basically saying that it doesn't do anything. So that's how science goes. The evidence at the time pointed to that nitrogen was helpful. And now some of the studies that he's looking at are showing that maybe that wasn't the thing that was creating this increase in yield. So this paper that I have cited on here basically talks about how, originally we were saying fall application of nitrogen, and then it produced higher corn yields. And though that seemed to be true on the fields that they tried it on, they didn't actually test the nitrogen levels in the plant materials or in the seeds, or were they looking at if the nitrogen that was being taken in by the plant was that applied nitrogen that they put on in the fall, or if it was just nitrogen that naturally lived in the soil. So in a more recent study, the one that is cited here, they looked at 6 different fields. And so this isn't research fields on campus, which is what a lot of the original studies were using the same fields over and over again to see if different applications were having a different impact. Well, with the newer study, they're using farmer fields around the state or in other studies, even around the country, and looking at how this really applies in the field. So they had 4 corn and soybean rotation fields and 2 continuous corn. And in all of the fields, because these are very large, or your standard large corn and soybean field, they were able to do multiple application types across these fields and look within the same field that has been farmed the same way by the same person for several years. They're able to look at how these different applications actually impacted the corn yields. And in some cases, it looked like basically no impact. So that's not great for a farmer that spent a lot of money and time applying nitrogen to their field just to find out that it really didn't have any impact. And in some cases, it was with the applied nitrogen, they actually had a lower yield, and in one case, they had a higher yield.
So Erin?
Yes.
Well, what about if a field is sterile?
Mm-hmm.
What happens then?
Well,
And
that's
can
a
a
good
field be
question.
sterile?
Um, Generally, yeah. I kind of get to that a little bit in this, but
Yeah.
yeah, that's a definite ongoing question for more research, right? If the sort of thought process in the last 30, 40 years, maybe even longer, probably longer, has really been like, if we just kill everything that's in the soil, we're killing all the bad stuff. And then we don't have to worry about insects or diseases or any of that stuff. And now it's like, but we need some of those. We need some of those microorganisms because they have this positive symbiotic relationship with the plants. So how do we keep those positive relationships without killing, or yeah, without killing everything by, fumigating or some of the other practices that we have right now, using pesticides, fungicides, all of that stuff. Yes, we're killing the bad ones, but we're also killing the good ones, and we need both. Just like in our human bodies, we have positive gut bacteria, and without that we get very sick or we have an upset stomach. We need those positive bacterias, and so how do we control the bad ones and keep the positive is definitely an ongoing question.
Oh, lovely. So are you going to talk to us about how you go from this to organic?
A little bit. I have some tips in a couple, or maybe even on the next slide, on what to do in your own garden or on your own land.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, with this, they actually measured the nitrogen in the plants, and they were able to sequence out the difference between the applied nitrogen and the nitrogen that was already living in or available in the soil. And what they found was, in the same case with these microorganisms, the microorganisms prefer the natural nitrogen. So if the plant might be getting some nitrogen through water uptake, which is definitely pulling from this applied nitrogen, but they're getting more of it from the microorganisms that live there. And the microorganisms are bringing them the natural nitrogen that lives in the soil. So if you have a higher microorganism population, your plant has more nutrients available to it. So that goes right along with what Elizabeth just asked in that, what do you do with sterile soil? If theoretically, if your soil is completely sterile, nothing will grow. If you're adding in nutrients and along with that, hopefully some microorganisms find their way in. A lot of times there's microorganisms living on the seed. So that can also be a problem with large corn and soybean production, or other even specialty crops, tomatoes and stuff like that. A lot of times you can purchase them with fungicides already applied. And if you're getting it in that way, you've killed all of the natural microorganisms that live on there. So we also want to think about the fact that every plant seemingly has its own signature microorganism family that it likes to work with. And I don't mean family as in like scientific hierarchy, but it has like its group of microorganisms that it really benefits from. And so if every plant is different, we can't just produce a microorganism slurry that you can add to every single plant and say that now that is perfect and going to work great. So it makes it really difficult to manage it in a way that's like to purchase an item to make the plant better. So yeah, so now I do have the gardening practices. They do have some of those nice microorganism slurries, inoculations that you can add to some plants. And in some cases, we know what works for certain types of plants. So for legumes, for example, for soybeans, there is an inoculant that you can, the bacteria that you can add, roll the seed in it before you plant it, and that helps increase the amount of atmospheric nitrogen that those legumes take in, and they store them in their root nodules. And then when the roots start to break down, there's more nitrogen available in the soil. So that's very common. That's why we have a corn-soybean rotation, because the soybeans fix nitrogen, fix meaning pull it from the atmosphere and leave it in the soil. So the soybeans pull in the nitrogen, and then the corn use a lot of nitrogen. So that's why we have that rotation. So we have an inoculant that comes in powder form that you apply to your soybean seeds before you plant them, and it introduces the rhizobial bacteria that are part of that nitrogen fixation. So in some cases we can make this happen, but we don't know all of the microorganisms that every single plant that people want to produce, mass produce, or even just have grow nicer, bigger, better. We don't know that, and it will take, we probably won't ever fully know, but it will take years and years of research for us to really say, here are all of the microorganisms that tomatoes need to have their best production. So you can inoculate the root zones. There are some specific plants that have an inoculant that you can purchase. So that is helpful. Living mulches is probably a better way to go. So just thinking back to the root zone is where all of the microorganisms kind of hang out. So we know from even before this that the nutrients are being taken into the plants through microorganisms. We knew that the microorganisms live in that root zone. They get their proteins and sugars and carbon dioxide from the plants, and they provide the plants with something they need. So it's a community. So if you grow a full field of crops throughout the whole summer, and then that field is totally empty all winter, there's no roots there. All of those microorganisms are either going to die, or they're going to move and go live in the grass, the grass root zone in the ditch, or go find a forest to live in instead. More than likely, most of them are just going to die because they can't move quite that far enough and reproduce quickly. They have a short life cycle generally. So if you can grow a cover crop and keep a root zone there, you might not have all of the specialized microorganisms that corn want or that tomatoes want, but you'll at least have a microbe society of some sort that will still live in that root zone. And it's easier for others to come in if there's already some life there, because they all live off of each other, right? They all feed off of each other. They are either predator or prey, and then you move to the next level and, they all feed off each other, they all help each other. So if you can keep some life going throughout the entire year, your plants are going to be better off. You're also keeping that nutrient cycle going instead of letting all of the nutrients just run out of the soil and then having to add them back in chemically the next year. You can kind of hold everything into the soil. So cover crops aren't just there to take in and hold the nutrients in there. So usually you use a cover crop, it'll take up the nutrients from the soil, and then you work it in the next year and it releases those nutrients instead of them leaching out in the rain. But now with this, we know that the microorganisms are also playing a role there. They are still breaking things down. They are being taken into the plant and coming back out, but they're really keeping all of that life going. So having a living mulch is going to set you up for better success for plant health. Strip tillage is what you see in this bottom photo here. So it's just tilling up the area that you have to and leaving some of that living mulch or cover crop growing in the areas adjacent. So you're only disturbing the root zone of a small space, and that is where you're going to plant your plants that will now create a new root zone and continue growing, but you haven't disturbed the entire microorganism system. You only disturbed a little strip of it. So hopefully those microorganisms can recolonize more quickly than they would have if you would have tilled the entire field. Not using any pesticides, so fungicides, all of the pesticides that would kill any insects. You know, that whole system is really important for creating airways and waterways deep in the soil, as well as now we know taking in those nutrients and making their way into the plant to disperse them. So we really want to not disturb, not sterilize our soil, right? We want to keep a lot of these things growing. If our plants are getting the nutrients they need, just like our human bodies, they have a better chance of fighting diseases. So it has, some of the studies have shown that plants with a really healthy microorganism colony in their root zone, that they have the ability to fight off diseases a lot better than other plants that might be growing really close to them. And it, you know, if we look at our own, again, we'll look at our own bodies and apply that to plants, it's working a lot in the same way. They get a disease, they send signals through their body that they need to attack that disease to stay healthy, because they ultimately want to grow seeds and reproduce. So they will do everything they have to do to fight this disease. If they can send out signals to other microorganisms to come in and help them with that, they don't have to work quite as hard at defending and fighting against that disease, and they can put more energy into producing a seed, which is usually what we want as humans growing the plants. We want them to produce a fruit or a seed because we're growing it for food. So we want them to focus their energy there and not have to focus on fighting diseases. So having the correct nutrients available. So I have plant health on there, you know, making sure that the plant has the nutrients it wants, as well as making sure that the microorganisms living in the soil have the nutrients that they want. So the suggestion at the moment, which I'm sure will change, but right now the suggestion is that magnesium, zinc, and iron are the really important nutrients to make sure that the microorganisms are really happy. And your plant also needs those things, but in smaller quantities. Our macros for plants are nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. So that's what we usually add in a fertilizer. So it seems as though a more holistic fertilizer, something like a compost tea that's going to have a little bit of all of the nutrients, is really more important, because we need to feed the microorganisms as well as feed the plants. And then some future research. How does intercropping work? So we now know that they're from just growing things and, you know, like traditional ecological knowledge that has been passed down. We know that some plants grow better with other plants, or that some plants don't like to grow near anything, or they only will grow with one other plant. But now we know that some of these chemicals or these signals are being sent out by the plant, or it's attracting bacteria that it knows will kill a different plant to really protect itself. So we need to look more at intercropping and how the plants really work together. There has been some research that looks at some of not just intercropping, but also like a cover crop, a crop following a cover crop. And so if you grow clover on the field, how does that impact corn production the next year? Or I think they were talking a lot about flax and how it worked with like chickpeas and stuff like that, and either growing together or growing following. So there's a lot more research. This research is going on right now that really needs to be looked at. So we do think that intercropping could have potential. We just need to really figure out which plants go well together. So a common cover crop that we use is clover with sorghum sudan grass, along with some other things. But the clover, they have now realized in some of these studies that the clover actually suppresses the sorghum sudan grass, which is not always a bad thing. Sorghum Sudan grass can get to be 10 to 10 feet tall, depending on the conditions and when you plant it. So if you're trying to grow that as a cover crop in your garden, that's kind of cumbersome. That's a lot. So actually growing it with the clover or with other legumes might be positive. It will still grow and it will give you a lot of organic matter. But if the clover can keep that from getting 6 feet tall and maybe suppress it to 4 feet tall, that's a lot more manageable for working it into the soil, whether it's your backyard or a field. So in some cases, these interactions, even if there is suppression happening, it might not be bad. And in other cases, you know, we want to maximize our field. So I have some photos on here of intercropping of that corn, soybeans, and oats, growing all of those at the same time. Is that really beneficial, or are they maybe limiting each other? Or even something like the top photo compared to the one below it on the left, where those strips are maybe 2 feet wide and the top photo is maybe 20 feet. I didn't really count the corn rows. We could figure that out if we really wanted to. But, you know, is there an intercropping even with things that might not like each other, but if you do 20 feet versus a 2-foot row, does it really have an impact on yields? And what does the microbial community look like? And what do the soil nutrients look like? And how does that impact air quality? You know, there's so many questions that go along with it. It is funding wise usually related to the yield that we're getting from it, from our crops, but we also, for science purposes, you know, we want to measure how it's impacting everything else around it. We also need to look at something like flame weeding, which right now is a main way that a lot of organic farmers weed. So there's a picture on the far right in the middle there. It really is just using flame and burning the top of the soil. And how does that impact the microbial community? And that's a question that people have already been asking and measuring. And it was sort of the belief that the microbes would kind of be below the soil surface far enough that when the heat came through, it wouldn't kill the whole community and it would be able to be recolonized. But when you're flame weeding, you're usually killing everything and then you're getting rid of that root zone. So maybe the microbes will just move away because they're threatened and some of them were killed. They aren't going to try to recolonize that area potentially. I don't know yet. That's a future research. Solarization is another way of killing weeds, where you put greenhouse plastic over the top of the soil and it heats it up above 100 degrees. And that will kill a lot of the weed seeds. But in doing so, it is probably also killing a lot of the bacteria and microbes. But to my knowledge, that's not something that has been measured in any solarization studies. So that's definitely something to add into some of those in the future to see how that actually impacts that microbial community. Oh, and I had thought of one other thing that I forgot to mention previously. How the impact of the rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is affecting this. So that point when the microorganisms enter the root zone, the way that their cell walls are made thin so that the plant can extract the nutrients is because they enter a highly oxidized area within the plant. But as carbon dioxide levels are rising in the atmosphere, the ratio of the pure oxygen or oxidized areas and the reduction areas in plants gets a little bit off. So it looks as though in some, again, very recent studies, that as carbon dioxide levels around plants rise, this ability of the plant to extract the micronutrients from the bacteria that it takes in is lowered. So there's hope that the plants will very quickly evolve to be able to handle this, but when it is just taking plants right now that are growing in our current atmosphere and exposing them to higher levels of carbon dioxide, like where we think we'll be in 10, 20, 50 years when, you know, even a few years out or I don't have the exact numbers, but as the carbon dioxide level increases, the plant health decreases, and it's because of its inability to get those nutrients out of the microorganisms. Okay, I think that's it. So yeah, here's our last slide. So I'll take questions. I've seen the little chat kind of light up a few times. So I'm going to stop the screen share so I can see more people and maybe see the chat.
So if you have a question, put your hand up. If you can put your hand up. Can you start your video? Maybe people don't want to do that. I can go through the chat box and ask you the questions from that, which I think is a good idea. And so there will be a copy of this recording later for everyone who wants to take in some of this enormous message, which has great implication for us, I feel.
And I would also mention that I usually find new studies to read or to look into from the Regenerative Agriculture podcast. So it's not all about this. It's also about cover cropping and no-till and just alternative growing methods. Yeah, most of the people on there are scientists working in this field, doing experiments, sometimes very infrequently just a farmer that has implemented a lot of these practices, but a lot of scientists on there. So that's Regenerative Agriculture podcast, and that's where I found a lot of the studies that I talked about today. There were a lot that I've read that I'm sure informed some of the things that I said that I didn't directly cite. So that's a good place if you really want to learn a lot more about this.
Thank you. Early on, you were talking about plants that stop other plants from growing around them. Mm-hmm. Is Tree of Heaven a good example?
I don't know. I mean, there are, and part of, yeah, so that's probably a bigger answer, but I would just say, I don't know exactly. I haven't seen anything recently that would say that they're directly looking at that plant, because we do know that the plants can also release a chemical that will inhibit other plants from going around it. So it's not all going to be the plant attracting microorganisms that are attacking the plants around it. The plants themselves do, in some cases, still have the ability to release a chemical that they produce internally and then release it through their roots that won't allow plants to grow around it. So it could be a little bit of both, but I'm not sure specifically if, I don't even know if any studies specifically have looked at that plant. So
right, like I think walnut puts out something, a toxic substance into the soil.
Yeah, black walnut, yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about cover crops and how they help or make fungal diseases worse. Do they help or do they hinder with a fungal disease?
They should help because it just having that root zone present for a longer period of time is going to keep that whole microorganism system working and functioning really well. I think it's when you don't have anything growing on the soil and everything moves away or moves out of the soil or dies, when you introduce a root zone again, of course, as with everything, the first things that are going to show up are going to be the bad things, the ones we don't want, right? It's just like if you have bare soil the first things to grow are the weeds. So anything that can take advantage of the littlest amount of nutrients, that's the thing that's going to show up first, and those tend to be harmful things. So I can't say for certain that every study out there is going to agree, because I haven't read them all yet, but I think the consensus is, you know, keeping a cover crop, keeping something on the land to have that consistent root zone, to keep the microorganism community really thriving is going to be the best bet. And there are some cases where the cover crop will reduce the yield of a plant the following year, but that has nothing to do with the fungal stuff. It's just the yield, which probably has to do with the specific microorganism community that exists. And again, there's not really enough research that has been done yet to say which cover crops will impact which actual crops. It doesn't seem that it's like a complete won't let it grow or anything. It just will impact the yield a little bit.
So I think for a long time, people who want to start a little bit of prairie flowers have been told, burn off whatever is on the ground at the moment, and then plant the seeds, scatter the seeds in the middle of winter. That obviously was instructions before we knew any of this. And do you think that with what you're telling us, that it's not a good idea to leave that soil bare from the summer or fall when one does a burn until the next spring when the seeds start to sprout?
I would say that if the seeds have been collected in that season and in that area, that this seems like it's actually establishing that microorganism community, because the seeds within them and on them should have the microorganism community that it's looking for, right? So if we burn off everything and then scatter fresh seeds that haven't been cleaned or bleached or anything like that, they still have all of their own biome on them. You scatter those on the land, and those microorganisms will have a chance then to colonize the soil before the plant starts to grow. So that actually seems like that might be what is going on underneath. And even though maybe we didn't know that scientifically when that suggestion was given, now maybe we know a reason why it works better.
Excellent. Is there any research being done on agroforestry or alley cropping and the benefits?
There is research going on with that, but I'm not sure that any of them are measuring the microorganisms in the soil as they relate to one another. But I would have to look. I know the Center for Agroforestry at Missouri is, I mean, they've expanded. They've recently gotten a lot of funding. They've hired a lot more people, and they are introducing a lot more research. So I'm not sure if some of their upcoming studies will include measuring the microbial communities in the soil and how they're affected based on plant combinations. But the just agroforestry studies in general have greatly expanded in the last couple of years. So I'm sure that will be a part of upcoming studies. And maybe it already has been and I'm just unaware of it. But there is a lot more agroforestry research going on than there was 5 years ago. It's definitely a growing field.
I heard an oversimplification, I'm sure, that in the field you've got bacteria and in the forest you've got fungi. Where would such an oversimplification come from? What's the basis for it?
I don't really know. Maybe just because people associate fungi with like mushrooms, and mushrooms grow in shady areas. Um, so I'd say what you can see with, well, you can't really see bacteria. I would say what you can see with your eyes would be like above the soil, maybe there's more fungi in a forest. But yeah, that definitely, I don't know. There's definitely fungi and bacteria in all soils.
Okay. So somebody read a blog about using diluted hydrogen peroxide to water houseplants. And they're wondering if that would increase the oxygen level at the root, as you mentioned.
I don't know. I haven't heard that.
I think it would be very easy to kill the plant by mistake.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that the plant is taking up oxygen from the soil, but maybe having it in a form or too much than what it's normally used to, it might not be able to handle that. I'm not really sure. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question.
That's okay. That's okay. Another question that you might not be able to give us an all or none on is solarization. You had that picture. Do you think it's good or bad, given that it would kill some of the microbes?
I think I haven't decided yet. I really like the idea of it. It seems like a really efficient way to get rid of a lot of the weed seeds that might exist, which means less time for the farmer in the field, which is good for the soil. You know, if we are hoeing less or cultivating less in general, whether with a tractor or, you know, with hand tools or pulling weeds, the less we can be in the field, the better it is for the soil structure. That is, you know, if we aren't driving tractors over it to cultivate 4 or 5 times, that is a lot better for the soil structure. So I think it'll be a trade-off. And I think, as I mentioned, more research needs to be done to see what the impact is on the microbial community, and if it if the community really does just sort of move down a few inches while the soil is hot, and then when you take the plastic off and the soil cools, maybe they move back up instantly, and there's really no impact or long-term impact. But we don't know that yet. So I think solarization is really good time-wise and soil health-wise, but we don't know what the impact is fully on the microbial community. So I don't know yet. I want to do more research on it, or somebody else to do more research and me to find out before I fully understand. But right now it does seem like a really viable option for specialty crop growers in order to not have as many issues with weeds, since our specialty crop growers, a lot of them are organic and don't use any herbicides, and so weeds take up a lot of their time and energy. So it seems like a good thing in that sense, but yeah, don't know yet.
Well, I think you know that a lot of the people listening to you have been doing things like rotating and mulching and trying not to get the foliage wet when they water, etc. Is there anything well, maybe you almost had it on one slide, anything that they could add, like microbes or anything like that, to help the soil with fungal disease particularly?
I think just sticking with, you know, fertilizing with a complete fertilizer and not just using something that is only nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or just adding like a pure manganese or copper or whatever it may be. Like, yes, those are things that the plants need, but we're also feeding the microbial community. So we want to provide a complete fertilizer because we don't necessarily know what all of those microbes need. One other tip was not using like sugars or something in when watering. So there are certain crops that, specialty crops that farmers will add not just a fertilizer, but a sugar or something specific with a protein into their water line that carries that stuff to the plants. And the suggestion was not to do that because, again, it's just like when you have the bare soil, the first thing to grow is a weed. When you are providing something so easily, like a pure sugar, the first thing that's going to show up is going to be probably going to be something bad that we don't want. So just really stepping back and just, you know, grow a cover crop, till as little as possible, using the complete organic fertilizers, rotating your crops. I think the recommendations right now are still really just good soil health, good plant health in general, and we're still trying to figure all of this out. So
I know some people have heard that higher carbon dioxide in the atmosphere causes at least soybeans to increase their yield. And I actually heard that poison ivy grows very, very well with higher CO2. So what impact does CO2 have on the microorganisms around the root?
So it's really just what the plant is taking in and how it's impacting the carbon dioxide to O2 within the plant. And again, every plant is going to be different. So potentially in the poison ivy and in the soybeans, maybe the plant is doing an okay job at keeping that balance, even with increased CO2. Or maybe for some reason with those plants, the microbes that plant attracts or wants, like the higher CO2. The study that I read specifically that was looking at the CO2 and said that there was a reduction in production with higher CO2 levels, they were specifically looking at tomatoes. So it could just be a different plant family. Again, I think just getting to the start of this research and that every plant is going to be different. So we have a long way to go before we can really answer all of those specifics.
A lot of us have also used Roundup here and there. What impact does Roundup have on the microbes?
Well, Roundup is really focused on killing weeds or plants, right? Not necessarily the microbes. So if it is taking out a dandelion, then you might lose the microbial community that is specific to a dandelion. But if you are spraying Roundup that is not, I don't use Roundup a lot. I'm very organic in farming stuff. So I guess the only things that Roundup doesn't kill are things that have been genetically modified for it not to kill. I think that's correct. So like Roundup Ready corn has a gene so that Roundup can't affect it. But otherwise it would kill everything. So, but it's just killing the plants. And there's probably other weed seeds in your soil that are instantly going to start growing again and put out more roots. So I think that the microbial community would still continue to live, but it will be hindered and definitely lose some of those microbes as you continue to kill the weeds and any roots that might be growing there.
How effective or practical is solid compost addition to the microbe community?
I think this is still, that's, a good complete fertilizer. The microbial community is still breaking down things in the soil. That includes at the soil surface, your worms and nematodes and insects are moving all of that around. And then the microbes down below can help break that down. So a solid fertilizer is just as good as a liquid complete fertilizer. It just depends on how quickly the plant needs access to those nutrients. So that's the same advice we've been giving even before we knew that the microorganisms were actually making their way into the plant. So the solid fertilizer obviously needs to be broken down a little bit more before the nutrients will be available, and the liquid fertilizer is going to be more immediate.
And so just one final question. If you think about growing special plants in your flower garden, very often you've got a space of a foot or 18 inches between plants because you want to show them off so nicely. Is that a large enough space to leave clear that the microorganisms will not be able to spread from one to the other and they will die?
Probably not. I mean, the plants, generally a root zone of a plant is about twice the size of the plant. So it depends on the root habit. So if it's a plant with a tap root, obviously it's going to go more straight down. It'll still have root hairs that come out to the sides, but not very far, versus something else that really likes to spread out. So it'll depend on the plant, and not all plants are going to attack those around it. So there are, you know, as we said, some beneficial plants, some intercropping that actually helps promote growth in plants. So it's really kind of at this point still about just trying it out and seeing what works. And, you know, maybe if you plant a peony in one spot and you have a peony in another spot that's not doing well, it might not be the sun exposure or the amount of water that it's getting or a squirrel that is attacking it. Maybe it is just the microbial community or a plant that's growing near it that's impacting it. So I think these things have probably been happening and we've observed them. We just never thought of it as an option, right? It was always like, what am I not doing? What nutrient isn't in the soil? Maybe there is a nutrient in the soil, it's just the microorganism isn't there that plant needs. Or a plant near it is inhibiting its growth in some way. So I'd say at this point, just kind of keep trying things and just consider that as an option when you're thinking about why isn't this plant growing? Maybe it's the plant that's growing next to it that is actually having the impact.
Well, Erin, thank you so very much. You've certainly given us a lot of food for thought and maybe also some food for our plants. So thank you very, very much. I think that we all enjoyed it enormously.
Thanks for having me. And everybody have a great week. And fall is almost here, so also a happy fall.